Hello and welcome to the Sandip Roy Show on Express Audio.
The Sandip Roy Show.
It was the stuff of thrilling historical romances. A queen without a kingdom, setting up court in a railway station, with her son and daughter, liveried attendants, carpets and dogs, demanding justice or at least her palaces back. The story of Begum Vilayat Mahal and her children Princess Sakina and Prince Ali Raza was always a journalist's dream. In 1975, she moved into the New Delhi railway station and declared that she and her family were the descendants of the House of Awadh. For 10 years, they stuck to that story and to that railway station. When the government finally granted them a home, the historic romance became a Gothic romance. They got Malcha Mahal, a 14th century hunting lodge in the middle of a forest in Delhi itself. From there, they would periodically summon forest correspondents via their landlines and recount their story and grievances. Were they really descendants of Awadh and Hazrat Mahal, or was this a huge scam? That was the question that dominated most of these stories. But a new book, The House of Awadh, The Hidden Tragedy, travels from Malcha Mahal to Pakistan, to Kolkata, to Kashmir, to Lucknow, to try and uncover a far more convoluted and complicated backstory. And it turns out that this was a story not just about Awadh. It's a story about people who kept falling between the cracks of history, of a family that had to keep reinventing itself as it tried to keep pace with history that took them from Lucknow to Pakistan to Kashmir and then to a hunting lodge in a forest in Delhi. The truth was far more complicated than a simple story of blue blood or not. Aletta, André and Abhimanyu Kumar followed the Awadh trail for years and are the authors of the book The House of Awadh, A Hidden Tragedy. We reached them in the Netherlands. Aletta, André and Abhimanyu Kumar, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
To someone who has never been to Malcha Mahal in Delhi, can you describe what it feels like, this place where a mysterious family shows up claiming to be descendants of Wajid Ali Shah and Hazrat Mahal and demanding return of his palaces? A lot of us have heard the story. I've certainly read it, but even I haven't never been to Malcha Mahal. What's it like?
Yeah, it's a 14th century hunting lodge, and it's kind of hidden behind thorny bushes. And there's a little bit of a trek that you have to make, you have to climb up an incline to reach there. When I first went there in 2014, I remember there used to be a signboard which said the House of Awadh with the old spelling OUDH, and trespassers will be gunned down. So it had even a bit more, forbidding aura. But now the signboard is gone. So now if you go, you can just make that climb. You will come across this building which is made mostly of stone. There are 6 bays in total. So there is a main hall where earlier there used to be a carpet which covered the entire floor, and there used to be a bed, and they had set it up properly and nicely as far as they could. But now if you just go, you will see that there is this big hall. And then there are rooms which are attached to it, separate bays. And there are staircases that go up towards the roof, which is quite big. And it affords you a very amazing view of Delhi skyline, especially the central Delhi part.
How far did you get when you went in 2014? Because at that time they were still there.
They were still there. So I did not enter. I had just gone to kind of see what it looked like because I was doing a story. And then I also saw that there was the ISRO building is also there, which even kind of added to the whole uniqueness of the situation, because here there is a medieval lodge and here there is high state-of-the-art technology for, satellite technology, and both existing together. with Malcha Marg, where all the diplomats live and even more influential and wealthy people.
Yeah. I thought it was surprising that this place is even there. Even the forest itself, in such a huge city of Delhi, and there's so much noise and so much crowd. And then suddenly you're in this completely kind of peaceful place. You can hear the birds and the monkeys, and it's just green. And then on top of that, in the middle of that greenery, there is this amazing monument. I was just surprised that it even exists when you don't even know about it. And yeah, when I first went, there was also the signboard. And we never even tried to go in, to be honest. I think you also feel like, okay, the signboard is there. These people want their privacy. Let's just not barge in.
But the privacy itself is a kind of facade, because then when I actually went in, I saw that there was hardly any privacy. There were no doors. Whatever iron grills they had were broken already, and anybody could enter. And as Sakina writes in her book, that is there, it's open to all sides, and it is in a completely damaged condition. And back then when they lived there, from the accounts we read, snakes were common and spiders. And when we went there, lots of bats and their feces on the ground, on the floor. And of course, it's dark most of the time, especially the inside part. And you also have these secret kind of staircases which go up till the roof, which kind of give it a more intriguing aura.
Yeah, but it's true what you say, because even though it has this air of mystery, we should also not romanticize, what it means to actually live there.
Because somebody who used to work there for the family, Qasim, you track Qasim down and he takes you there. What was his reaction to going back to the place, and what did he tell you about how they met the basic needs most of us take for granted in terms of living a day-to-day life in the middle of a place like that?
To go back there, he was quite emotional, because the time when we went back, some time had passed since Ali Raza had died by then, but there was still a lot of things there to be found, which have by now completely disappeared. Now it's just an empty monument. But at that time, there were clothes scattered around, for example, and he recognized them. There was also a tree on the rooftop, which he recognized as Vilayat having planted it as a, sapling, and he was holding it. And even now that tree is cut, we found at our most recent visit. So for him, it brought up a lot of emotions he felt to this family, to which he felt loyal till the end. Like initially, he didn't even want to speak to us because he had promised them he wouldn't. And it took almost a year before he went on the record for our story and our book. As for living there, they tried to dig a well, for water, and it failed. So initially they tried to find out what we can make of it.
They had a water tanker as well from MCD. It used to come and deliver them some water. With ISRO also, they had actually established a connection. So later they got electricity from there, even water sometimes. As far as food is concerned, I remember Qasim telling me, and it's not in the book, but they used to get food from a restaurant in CP as well. Other than Ali Raza also going to Nizamuddin, which I had written long back in a story, for getting meat for his dogs. They had electricity, we saw bills, telephone they had, which Mr. Pradeep Kishan got them, for which they also used to pay bills. They had their bank account as well. So somehow they used to manage all these necessities of daily life, as you put it.
They had a few people who helped them, who really kept behind the scenes, like, some reporter, forest guards, ISRO people.
Laborers as well.
It made me think that this is only possible at that time. In today's so-called digital India, it would have been impossible to live the kind of life they did, cut away from the world, answering landlines. It's a very different world.
It was a different world, which they had kind of still managed to keep going as the rest of the world was modernizing around them. But it was kind of almost the end in which it was still possible, as you say. It would have been very difficult post-COVID. And so that, true.
And that sense of isolation you also feel when you are at the monument, and especially on the rooftop, which, you see this stretch of forest above you. Then you see the city in a far distance. You see the parliament, and you can imagine that this view has not changed, all the decades that they lived there. But so also their life within the monument, they started more and more living in the past. They were writing about the past. They were protesting about things that happened in the past. They were unable to move on.
And now I read that this has become sort of part of a ghost walks and ghost trails in Delhi. So this is like the ultimate fate of Malcha Mahal. But even at that time, I'm sure there were lot of rumors of ghosts and things like that. I mean, a place like this would inspire such rumors.
Yeah.
Yeah, there were rumors. Anyway, there's also a dargah in the forest, which is said to, the pier there is said to be able to exorcise jinns. And there's all this, this matkas that have the jinns inside, captured inside. So there's more places in the same forest near to that have this stories of mystery. And at the time, there were also rumors, like forest guards were telling rumors that, people went there and never came back. And we don't know the identities of these people who supposedly never came back.
Nothing of the sort.
And, or they heard the sounds of music and dance coming from there. No, these stories were there before, you are right. By the way, the ghost walks have now stopped because of some cracks in the monument. Delhi government cannot take the responsibility of hosting big groups in there as of now. So some restoration work is quite urgent, actually, for the monument.
Well, let's not start at the real beginning of the story, which you do, but at the point most people encountered this, which was the waiting room of the New Delhi railway station.
Mm.
That's where this family kind of burst into international consciousness. Mm. Tell us what happened there and when was this?
This was at the start of emergency almost. I think 74, 75.
Yeah, it was early 75 when we found the first newspaper article of them having just arrived at the railway station 3 months back. And that's when they also themselves, started to ask the attention of the world. Because for the years that they were in Kashmir, they didn't do that as such. They just petitioned the government for their return. But at that moment, by settling at the railway station, they consciously attracted attention from journalists. And the first article appeared in Hindustan Times at that time.
Yeah, and it was not easy sailing for them because the railway authorities did not like it and they tried to get them.
Obviously, I don't blame them.
They were desperate to get them out of there. And the family was also desperate to find some kind of a foothold because, just to recap it quickly, because in Kashmir, things had turned against them a little bit. Because in the book itself, we have written that one of the neighbors, who was a child then, but a bit older in class 10, he said that surveillance had increased at that time. They were always under the watch of the intelligence agencies because being Pakistani Muslims and settled in Kashmir, they were a bit suspect to the intelligence, which was also trying to kind of gain its foothold in the state, where it was being resisted by the state authorities, the Kashmiri state authorities. So that tussle was going on. And by that time, also Indira Gandhi abolished the Privy Purse. And she kind of came out with her, as I see, the last gambit or her final card up her sleeve, that she had a royal connection. And managed also, amazingly, to kind of get a pension, which we produce a document that she was getting that pension as well. And so Sakina writes that we came there to protest that the Privy Purse had been abolished or that we are getting a very small amount. But I think they had run out of options completely. And it didn't go very well at the station for 10 years, the state.
Some sympathy was there coming from Lucknow because they said we are descendants of Hazrat Mahal as well. And there's a lot of sympathy for Hazrat Mahal in Lucknow. But yeah, in Delhi at the time, with Privy Purse abolished, emergency coming up, they were not that welcome.
But having said that, it's still pretty darn amazing that in that climate where Indira Gandhi is packing off all her opponents to jail all over the country, she's abolished the Privy Purse, she's throwing the Rajamata of Jaipur into jail if needed, that these people were able to get away with it as long as they did in the waiting room of Delhi. I mean, it's quite amazing that somebody didn't come at the dead of night and kind of pack them up and throw them out.
They tried. Like, there is an incident where she said they sprayed water on her, belongings, or they would come and threaten us. Sometimes there would be thefts as well. So they were kind of in a long tussle with the railway authorities. We also think that Vilayat had this old connection with the railways because her father, as it comes in the last chapter, a little bit of it, that had some connections with railway authorities.
He worked for the railways.
He worked for the railways. So she may have managed to pull some strings here and there. There was a Kashmiri Pandit, just a Kashmiri Pandit officer also towards the end, Mr. Raina, and I personally think that it could have played a role as well in establishing some things.
No, and what you're describing, that was more like goons harassing them. It was not like, the full might of the Indian state, I would say. And yeah, I mean, there's also rumors that say, like, okay, why not? In the end, like what officials told us was that why were they given the monument? That it was a decision by Indira Gandhi. So though they only moved there the year after, about half a year after she was killed. And there were again discussions, was it really decided or was it just a suggestion? They were still trying to get prevent it from happening, some authorities, but finally they went there, and that Indira Gandhi had just, sympathy for her woman to woman. I don't know if...
No, there is one thing, the right wing, for example, I mean, there has been an article or two in right wing press about this, which does think that there was some kind of appeasement.
The theories there, and even within Lucknow, there are also theories that it was because they were Shia and there was this very strong Shia-Sunni politics going on in Lucknow itself. And the politicians that were championing them in the parliament were not Muslims or Shia themselves, but they were going for that constituencies. But yeah, for sure, from the railway authorities, the railway ministry, there were multiple, desperate calls and letters to others saying, just, get rid of this woman.
Get this family and their servants and their dogs and their crockery and their furniture out of our waiting room. Now that we live in this sort of age of social media, I can see that they understood the power of media very well by selectively giving interviews, only choosing foreign journalists and all of that. They were also, in their own way, keeping the mystery alive, even as they always seem to complain about the coverage they got. And so the stories invariably, because it was such a fascinating romantic idea, these people parked in a railway station, then they moved to this ruined palace in a jungle, which is even more romantic, right? Wouldn't have been the same if they moved to government quarters in some block in Noida. So much of the coverage boiled down to who were they really? Were they really royalty? Where did they come from? Was that the question that interested you?
I mean, to some extent, yes, but we wouldn't have written a book on only that question. So we were also not sure what we'll be able to find out. Yeah, just the question, are they really royal or not, is not that interesting at the end of the day. And also towards the end, the coverage then also became a bit of the question, are they lying to us or not? So we actually wanted to go beyond that. And we also had to remind ourselves multiple times during the research that we were not going for that question, because ultimately you are interested, right? Of course, we cannot deny that we're also interested in that question, but we didn't think that would make a book-worthy story as such. We were going for how were they influenced by history? What is the full context of this story? You already mentioned emergency. If you go more back to their time in Kashmir, the 50s and 60s, Kashmir was also a very interesting period, very different from how we are thinking of Kashmir now, post-militancy. And before that, partition. And, Lucknow before partition. And, way before that, then, Awadh and what happened there, which is a history they were very interested in. So I think to find out who were they really and who were they as people beyond the caricatures that they created themselves to some extent, but that was also enhanced by media coverage.
But I mean, it's a story that then takes you everywhere. I'm reading the book and, you're in Lucknow, you're going to Delhi, of course, Karachi, Lahore, Srinagar, Gandarbal, so many RTI requests. That's a lot of investment of time and money. Yeah. And as I'm reading it, I'm thinking, okay, this is a much covered story. The principles in it are dead. When you start and when you were putting in so much time and money into this, were you not scared that is this all going to be a big wild goose chase?
Yeah, we were worried. We were worried, certainly. But I saw no other way than to, of course, you are commissioned to write a book. That's the mundane explanation. You have to write it and do a good job. At the same time, our curiosity also got the better of us and we took the risk. It was a bit of a gamble. But we also wanted to know, because there were certain things, if I may, which were kind of prodding us that there is something deeper, because her knowledge of history, for example, was quite accurate as I cross-checked. There was also a possibility that this itself in this thing to have such detailed knowledge that Hazrat Mahal had a rumored lover other than, Wajid being Wajid Ali Shah's wife is in itself in the realm of some, deep historical knowledge. If you know only about 1857 and what other English historians were writing. And I came to know this through Vilayat and Sakina's account. So I suspected that they did know quite a fair bit. Other than that, I also saw a kind of sincerity in how they were presenting their demands to however it may seem to others, but something about them kind of seemed authentic to me.
There's two other things I would add. One is that we did have a lot of help also from others that are acknowledged in the book. There were, was a reporter in Lucknow who helped us, a photographer in Kashmir who helped, also a great reporter in Lahore. We were based out of Delhi. I also traveled to all these places in Pakistan for my work as a South Asia correspondent. So in that way, resources were cleverly used.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the wild goose chase.
Yeah.
I spent an entire day going through a literal truckload of bags of completely unorganized archive papers of the Karachi Flight Club, that were partially flooded and eaten just to see if I could find their name, and I didn't. So you get also lost in these sidetracks because of pure interest, what else can be found.
But we kept getting something or the other, which kept us going as well. It became a duty to follow the leads because something or the other would turn up as well.
Yeah. But the other thing also beyond really finding the facts, there was also kind of the sub-narrative about how do we treat people that live on the edges of society, and someone who is just, described by what I earlier said, this caricature, who has been kind of sidelined as probably crazy. Daughter Sakina, who wrote a book that has been only described as like mostly unreadable. So we also felt an interest in taking them a bit more serious and to see what story are they telling. And as it turned out, also Vilayat was, they were quite part of the political elite of, early Pakistan nation builders. And there was ambition that was crashed. And there was a lot more humanity to the story that we also wanted to uncover that would go way beyond royal or not.
So where did you begin?
Malcha Mahal.
Malcha Mahal,
Yeah.
we really did begin with Malcha Mahal because we were writing a story about Atlas Obscura, this travel website. So we were looking quite deeply into it, its history, which is there as well. Others, from the work of others also, we benefited. We must say Arpit Parashar, who is no more, unfortunately, wrote a wonderful piece about Malcha in Fountain Ink a long-form narrative piece. That gave us some ideas. And Aletta managed to track down some artists who were living there.
We got some hints also. I think when we talked with so many people about, friends that we're working on this. And I think one of our friends mentioned, like, there used to be this artist. Then we found out that used to be a residency, and I met this artist, and he had his own newspaper archive with pictures and articles of Malcha Mahal that were not online.
Yeah.
That was there. But and then of course after Ali Raza died, the
access was easier.
The access of the material that they left behind, then the phone number of Qasim, many other phone numbers that led to nobody also. We called many phone numbers.
Book also you managed to access through Leonie, who was also doing good work. Through her work also we got a more sympathetic understanding that there are others who look at them also with some empathy.
So I'm Dutch, and coincidentally a Dutch photographer who was living in Delhi at that time when we started the research as well. She actually somehow visited Malcha Mahal when Ali Raza was alive. He asked her to archive their photos. So she was kind of doing this voluntary work for him. And through her, that the photo archive, document archive, the starting point was Malcha Mahal. And we made a list of things like, Kolkata, Lucknow, but Nepal also. We never actually went to Nepal in the end.
Because Hazrat Mahal had ended up there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. We drew up a trajectory and basically we tried to follow the trajectory.
So the three places that, you went to all these places, three places where they were personally very involved and where you are trying to find people who might have known them. Of course, Lucknow, Pakistan and Kashmir.
Yeah.
I wanted you to talk a little bit about what you uncovered in each, because they were very different facets of the same people. Sometimes the characters even have different names. The children have different names in different places. So let's start with Lucknow. What did people, given that they were claiming to be the descendants of Awadh, how were they remembered in Lucknow? What did you find?
Well, it depends a bit who you ask.
Exactly.
Of course, there's pre-partition Lucknow and 1970s Lucknow. We didn't meet anyone personally who was alive in pre-partition Lucknow and knew them from that time. But we met the people who knew them in the 1970s. There are some other competing Nawabs who are also competing with each other for like who is the most real Nawab of Awadh, kind of. They all have different. And of course, the House of Awadh is huge. Wajid Ali Shah famously had many wives.
Yeah, wives, concubines, temporary wives.
Yeah,
365.
Yes, and then there were, ministers and like whatnot. So there's many people who can legitimately claim to have some kind of link to House of Awadh, and all of them were not accepting Vilayat as being part of them. There's a huge registry, and her name is not in there, but can easily be explained because she, even in the book of Sakina, she claims her descendancy through females. But then others who, like regular people who worked with them, remember them very fondly.
Even with the royals, when I started, Aletta, I started interviewing them, we realized that their initial position was that, okay, we don't know and everything. But if it's there in the book that Mir Zafar Abdullah also after a while said, no, but I know that she used to move amongst royalty before independence. And he told me where you could find the house. So I think that was their external position as competing Nawabs who don't want any threat. But then they were also not 100% sure. And he also tells a story in which he says that she became enamored of a relative of his. I see the city part also a bit like, the character of the city also comes across because Lucknow has this large Shia population and that entire suffering thing and all, with other monuments also as testimony to Shia faith. In Kashmir also, you have these large Muharram celebrations. And they had come after undergoing, as she said, the death of her son and death of her husband. And when she participates in the Muharram procession there, that grief kind of comes through. Then Karachi, you see, was actually the first capital of Pakistan. And their nation building is going on. And again, she is very much part of this new city, which is being built bureaucratically as well as materially in other ways.
I would add to in Lucknow also what we found is that her basic demand, right, when she came to Delhi at the railway station was that we want our palaces back. So nobody thinks, and we are also not arguing for that she should have owned those palaces.
Right. I mean, as opposed to, as you said, like there are hundreds of other descendants of Wajid Ali Shah.
Yeah, but there is a lot of agreement to the idea that these palaces have been neglected in the hands of the government.
So that was an interesting finding because, those are the kind of things that because of her highly subjective view of history, some of these things could have been put better and she might have received even better purchase for that if she had just said that these buildings are in a terrible condition without going hammer and tongs about them being returned to her.
Now, the Pakistan part is the part which becomes, to me, the most almost fascinating part of the book because it's the part which they quickly stop talking about in interviews over time. And I'll come to the essential mystery which you grapple with as to how were these people who had left and after partition gone to Pakistan become involved with Kashmir politics of all things and then been allowed to come back to India and not just come back to India, settle in Kashmir. You said they were involved in nation building. What kind of sources were you able to find in Pakistan as to how much in elite circles did they actually move?
Well, I mean, the first story of the first source, I think, very interestingly, is a book that appeared some years back co-written by a British historian, Sara Ansari, and we interview her also because she mentions Vilayat. Of course, in Lucknow, we find out about, which also has been previously reported by New York Times, but it was also confirmed by the people we met in Lucknow that her husband's name was Butt. So that makes her name when they were living in Karachi, she was known as Vilayat Butt. So then we came across a book about the women's movement in Pakistan, about the women around the first prime minister's wife, Rana Liaquat Ali Khan. Women's movement, like partially they were helpful in like helping the refugees, but also they were doing all these They were debating all these questions about what does it mean to be an Islamic state. And when we spoke to Sara Ansari, she told us that she had no idea who she became in India later, and that this was the Vilayat, or like she didn't even know about the story about Vilayat Mahal. But had she known about the story, she would not have made that connection that these were the same women. So she just mentioned her as one of the women activists. So then when I went to Karachi, I got the chance to go into the newspaper archive of Dawn, one of the major English language publications. They have their headquarters in Karachi. And I came across like about a dozen newspaper articles that were relevant. Multiple mention her. So she was the treasurer of the Women's Muslim League, and she was at some point of time the president of the Karachi chapter of the Jammu and Kashmir Muslim Conference. She was very politically opinionated and active in these organizations, and she was, close enough to this small, like Sara Ansari. Also, she's a specialist in like this early years in Karachi as a historian. It was a very small kind of elite circles that she was very much part of. So that's what we found out in more detail.
You find out she ends up having an altercation with no less than the prime minister of the country, and then gets thrown in a mental hospital, which even the New York Times article talks about. Was that well recorded?
Yeah. So she, in that article, it was told to her by her son who lived in London, who has by now passed away. But yes, it was confirmed by newspaper articles there that this is what happened, like after she confronted the prime minister, and this happened at 14 August. She is arrested. And then there's multiple court hearings that are recorded by the newspapers. And then the court declares her a lunatic, which is the word that was used at the time. And she is ordered by the court to be sent to a mental institution. Now, we thought it was a bit suspicious because she is so politically outspoken. And 1954, the year when it happened, was also very important for the history of the plebiscite regarding Kashmir. She was part of the Jammu and Kashmir Muslim Conference, and the Prime Minister also mentions Kashmir in his Pakistan Day speech, which is the moment when she interferes and she speaks up.
Very specifically, she says he didn't do anything for Kashmir, so her protest seemed completely political. Then how is she mad?
Yeah, so to us, it seemed more like she was being silenced rather than really, though she herself, apparently, according to the newspaper report, she herself gave the statement that she was possessed by a jinni. But we don't know the circumstances under which she gave such a statement. And the historian we spoke to also agrees that for, politically outspoken woman in the 1950s, who also had important family members, because by that time she had grown up sons who were part of the Air Force. So it might have been a deal with her family to kind of prevent this case to ever go to court. And there were even opinion article or like an editorial in one of the newspapers that voiced this suspicion as well. That said, Mrs. Butt.
He is guilty, then we are all guilty. They were not buying it. The newspapers were also not buying it. And this year was important for India-Pakistan relationship because I came across this thing which has been completely forgotten, that there was a real chance of a plebiscite. And also this thing that we often call Nehru's folly. But if you see it from that point of view, taking it to the UN, because Sheikh Abdullah himself was on India's side, Nehru was in a very strong position at that time. The whole thing started to change after he is put in jail in 1953. And then Pakistan signs the Defense Pact and the whole thing kind of blows up. And just to come back to it, because it is the Cold War era as well, and the husband was also playing a role in nation building by being an important official in that airline which they had set up, which was all part of it. And also the son was in the Air Force.
Which then leads right into the question, and I'm curious whether you feel that you found a satisfactory answer to this, given that this is a person who was obviously politically so active, who confronts the Prime Minister of Pakistan on the issue of Kashmir, has sons who are in the Pakistan Air Force. When that person says, I want to come back to India, India lets them. That seems like if you were writing the novel version of this would feel like a huge plot hole.
Yeah, so the only thing we can think is that somehow they probably considered her, because she was in favor of plebiscite. And I will give my own opinion from what I understood, is that Kashmir at that time was also heavily politicized. And from other sources that I read, which is not all in the book, for example, to make another connection, when we speak of in the royal chapter, who the real royals of Calcutta, who are the original descendants, when Yusuf Mirza is being talked about, which I found in Srinagar State Archives, the government said that it took it in his favor that he had spoken to some TV channel favorably about Kashmir. So the government, I feel, might have wanted to use her in some way or the other. We know now it didn't come to pass. But
there's also, there is this whole file with the National Archive that includes a discussion between different departments and bureaucrats and officials about whether she should be allowed or not. Yeah, and there might be more to it because the file also refers to other files. And when we tried to get those files via RTI, they were not available. They say at some point that she has some issue with the government of Pakistan. And it seemed to kind of draw the conclusion from that, or just assume from that, okay, if she has an issue with the government of Pakistan, then she's on our side. But that was not the case. She was part of an organization that wanted the independence of Kashmir.
Yeah, and of course there is that thing that we do think, and we have put it in the book, that she had contacts with this leftist intelligentsia group in Kashmir, which had very good contacts with Kashmiri politicians, including Mr. Sheikh Abdullah himself. And the IB does object, actually, in the beginning. They have no land, they have nothing, and it kept harassing them. So there was a split in the government. We think that the more conservative section of the government, which is IB, kind of did not want them, but the government allowed, I think maybe because Mr. Nehru had good contacts with Kashmiri politicians, and somehow
the local authorities, they might have given some guarantee or some kind of promise that, okay, we actually know, because André Sadiq is also, we spoke to her grandson, and he said that they knew each other from pre-partition Lahore.
Yeah.
And so, personal context probably played a role. Because otherwise it is indeed quite a mystery.
It is a mystery.
And also it continued to harm them a little bit. Like Abhimanyu earlier mentioned that they were being watched. Okay. And there were also rumors amongst classmates of the children, for example, and questions, why are you here?
This rumor is known in Kashmir that they had a hand likely in the assassination of Liaquat Ali Khan.
Yeah, not all of them, but the husband, Vilayat's husband.
The husband, because the husband also, we should mention, dies somewhat suddenly soon after Liaquat Ali Khan's death.
He dies already in 1951. We also found his condolence message in the newspaper of the time, 1951. And the family says he dies of heart attack, but that he dies that he was actually in Lahore, which is around where he's from, and that suddenly he was called back to Karachi.
He was on a vacation, in fact.
And he took a train. Yeah, he was on leave. As a government duty, he was on leave, but then suddenly he was called back to duty, and either on the train or upon arrival, he has a heart attack and died. And Vilayat, in her letters to the Indian government, claimed that he was poisoned, which when we floated this theory with her family source in Lahore, first he was like, no, we don't know about it. He had a heart attack. But then later he was like, it was a bit suspicious that he was called back. And who knows, maybe, why not, So, but again, this is rumor theories.
But we do think that some persecution of those who may have had links with left as well as Kashmir may have suffered for Liaquat Ali Khan's assassination, because both things played a role. Later on, the coup attempt as well.
How did people you talked to in Kashmir remember them? Because at this point, the whole Awadh thing is not coming up. They are not talking about being the descendants of Awadh yet.
No.
Not
so much.
Yeah.
It depends, because as we try to trace their journey in Kashmir, we do think that when they came to Gandarbal, which was Mr. Sadiq's constituency, in fact, a stronghold, as his grandson told us. So they were probably sent there. And there they kind of established a good rapport with the locals. They're playing cricket. Sakina is going to school. When they come to Kashmir, even then, that part was quite isolated, brain area, and not so much now. There are a lot of buildings and everything. It's much more developed that way. So I think even then, in that relative isolation, they were doing okay. But because there is an episode there where Sakina loses her temper, which we found somebody who actually saw that somebody teased her in college or something. Her college mate, Imtiaz, she told us, no? Salim Naqshbandi's wife, that Sakina was taunted with that. And I think so that must have started the unraveling other than the intelligence kind of keeping a watch, and it must have played a role in worsening their mental health. Because if the intelligence keeps on coming, it's stigma as well. And then others don't want to ally with you or associate with you so much. But you do see that if one sees that there are, really the well-regarded families of Kashmir who are in touch with them. For example, even the great poet Agha Shahid Ali's family is in touch with them. Then other influential families such as those from the Suffering Moses shop, which is a well-known shop, and then others.
It's important to note that they had actually good relations with the neighbors. Vilayat was, when they were in Gandarbal, somebody said like Vilayat used to sit on the porch looking at passers-by. They were offering food to the children. And the children played cricket with the other kids there. And, Abhimanyu, he went there, he met someone with a small shop who was a teenager at the time. Sakina was also a teenager. And he just, he became emotional from seeing her photo, and he kissed the screen, and he was like, it was such a good memory for all of these people. Like they lived there for 2 years, but they had really fond memories of the kids. And then we're talking about Sakina, Ali Raza, but also their brother Asad, who so far is not so much known of, but all these people in Kashmir remember him really well.
Everybody is more fond of Asad, I would say.
Because he's the brother who gets left behind and who stays behind in Kashmir when the family moves to Delhi. Was anyone able to give an explanation as to why they left this one brother behind? And he eventually dies quite sadly alone in Srinagar.
I think he chose to leave behind because he was kind of, as she says, he was holding the fort there. Maybe he was trying to keep the last relations, if at all they returned in any case from the station. Maybe they thought it was a temporary arrangement. Maybe after Asad dies, this thing becomes really irrevocable. Till 5 years, he didn't die immediately. He stayed for 5 years.
He kept the house there, the house where they were all living together. He continued living there in the same neighborhood. And he also visited them in Delhi and also traveled to Lucknow. This is what Qasim told us. He traveled together with Asad to Lucknow. So that was very surprising to hear, because otherwise in Delhi, nobody ever remembers Asad being there amongst them. But he did visit, and also the people in Kashmir confirmed that he left sometimes, he was away for a week or two.
And did you figure out why their names kept changing? The children, everybody seems to have known them by different names.
So what we found out, there was this confusion, right? House of Awadh is a Shia family. But wait a minute, Bhatt is a Sunni name. So were they Sunnis? Were they Shias? What's the story? So, without going in too much detail and keep something for the readers, we can say that she had a dual identity from both her parents. She had a Shia and a Sunni identity. Her father was the Sunni, and that's why she probably was raised as a Sunni, and most of her family members identify as Sunni. After her husband died and she left Pakistan, she came back to India. Once they arrived in Kashmir, she started to identify as a Shia. So that was already one identity change from Sunni to Shia, for which both of the identities she can claim from her family. It's not just something she made up. I think they changed the names accordingly. According to that identity. So initially the name that Sakina used was Zora, and that was actually also, I think it was Vilayat's mother's name. Yeah, it was the name of one of her ancestors, her mother or grandmother.
Though that is not the name that Sakina uses for the grandmother in her memoir that she writes. She has a different name for the person she says is Vilayat's grandmother.
Namrud.
And we have no way of knowing if that's what Vilayat had told her or where she got that name from. And the New York Times story that you talked about tracks down the fact that there is another brother who lives in England, the one who had gone away as a young person from Pakistan and was sending them money and helping support. And that story created this impression that this was an enormous scam, that there's this brother in England that she was completely silent about, and he's sort of paying it. Even he does not give credence to the Awadh story. So as journalists, I wonder, do you feel stuck? I mean, these are there now. We have two family members who are giving sort of different and contrasting stories.
Yes. So we do think that, so right when that story came out, then write a story, and Shahid's testimony was, as far as I understood, was the heart of it. And we think he was a half brother.
No, we don't know that.
So that was doubtful to start with, because there were contradictions, which we saw as loopholes. Then there is also the fact that at 14, he says he left the country. Then who gave him a passport? He's a minor. How does he go? So there are other factors at play. Then he is on his deathbed. And I don't know if out of his, sometimes it happens, out of your whole life believing in something, nothing comes of it, and you just abandon it completely and you trash everything along with it. I didn't see why, of all the people, his testimony should be the only one that should decide. So that's why we wanted to find out if there are other relatives. And yes, the family is divided over the issue.
It was very different from all the other stories that appeared beforehand, and it uncovered some either unknown or, like the brother, for example, in London was completely unknown, or kind of forgotten things, like, the Pakistan connection. It was actually reported in 1975 as well in the first articles that were there about the railway station. She told reporters everything about, that they were in Pakistan before and then in Kashmir, and that her husband died and his name, and that he used to work for Lucknow University. All of these things were shared by Vilayat as well, but completely kind of forgotten and overshadowed by, the more attractive story about, oh, this is a queen. But yeah, it's true. We also speak with another relative, and he says, the family is divided over it. And he says, again, there's multiple things. One of them is, again, the Shia Sunni thing. Like if you are a descendant from the House of Awadh, from a Muta wife of the king, then as a Sunni, we don't accept that as a marriage.
Muta wife is the temporary wives.
Yeah, we don't see that as a marriage, and we cannot accept that kind of heritage or like descendants. So we don't talk about that.
But it was also not the first debunking, because we received a long note of complaint from them because they had complained to a BBC report, which we haven't seen, but that had also similarly debunked them. So I think the debunking had started happening, and the New York Times kind of added new layers to it.
Yeah. And of course, there's also the Kolkata family who from the very beginning said, like, this is not a descendant of Hazrat Mahal, because we are the descendant of Hazrat Mahal and she is not part of our family or other relatives.
I was curious, did you try and speak to the New York Times about what else they had found out which may not have been in the article?
Oh, no.
New York Times, we heard from others what they kind of may have or may not left, but because even your source said that they were in touch, but they didn't present that story, his story, which could have contradicted it, maybe.
No. They were in touch, but he didn't tell them anything.
He didn't tell them.
Yeah. So, because he also took some convincing to speak, because he gave us a huge test of knowledge. And if we understood the whole Shia Sunni Muta marriage significance and nuances, and when he was convinced that, we understood a bit of that background, then he said, like, well, yeah, because that was not in that story.
As you uncovered the layers, the story gets more and more complicated because there are so many cultural nuances involved. There's so much of subcontinental history that is happening in the background. Without knowing the actual truth, I see Vilayat is also shifting her story to match the time, the zeitgeist of the time, when it's okay to talk about Pakistan, when it's not okay to talk about Pakistan. Let's not talk about the son who is in the Pakistan Air Force. Would you say that they were covered somewhat differently by foreign media as opposed to Indian media? Did that coverage change over time?
I think the foreign media was interested in the exotic aspect. For the longest time, till like around the 90s, its opinions started to be like, a bit more unflattering.
Yeah, I think initial coverage from the 70s and 80s, I think a lot of foreign media very seriously present her story of the injustice done to Awadh and the continuous injustice by the Indian government who's not taking care of the palaces, etc. But then later on, they don't really go into that history anymore, and it's more of the exotic. But I think the Indian media also had an interest in that exotic, like it was not just the foreign media. The other thing that I wanted to add was that also that within her own family, there was the Shia Sunni thing, but there's also kind of not everyone was sympathetic with her. So her relative, what is his theory is that she was the second wife of her husband. And that doesn't necessarily give you kind of the best status. And also she was very ambitious. And when that ambition and that when she was politically outspoken and when that was crushed by the courts and she was declared a lunatic, that was with support of her family, because they wanted her to be silenced. So I think that she had within her own family maybe a bit of the image of the crazy aunt, and that must have been passed on to even her son in London.
She must have become persona non grata. Like, anybody from the family could justifiably complain to her that, okay, you are so active in Kashmir, but if you go and heckle the prime minister, then the burnt we are going to bear all together.
And it's also a fact, as you document, that while some people admired her, some people found her rude and high-handed and arrogant and sort of dismissive. So you want your victims to conform to a certain stereotype as well. Not and some people who might say that, one could say it wasn't even a great injustice that had been done to them that needed to be righted in terms of the demands they were making, return these palaces to us.
Demands were certainly not modest.
Given that they were not really going to get these palaces over any of the other claimants of Wajid Ali Shah, what do you think should have been their due? Because you cover them with a lot of empathy. And I'm using the word empathy as opposed to sympathy because we don't know these people personally. How does this story matter now in 21st century India?
It's really hard to say how they should have been received completely. Like in Lucknow, some people tried pretty hard, they were invited there, they were shown apartments, houses. I think their due would be this story. I mean, I'm not saying this is the definite story, but to be just declared a liar and the subject of a haunted house tour, I think was not doing justice to the full story.
People did try to compensate them. I think Vilayat, others have also argued in other conversations we have had, that Vilayat could have accepted the house that she was being given. She was getting a pension. I'm sure that the UP government would have given her more money as well, probably if she had gone there. But I don't know if she really wanted her due or because of her sheer sense of suffering and her feeling that her grief was so irrevocable. Her husband is gone. So maybe she kind of more and more again grew into this role of a suffering Shia woman who has been wronged by governments and just could not find her way out of that.
After Vilayat died, initially Sakina and Ali Raza were completely, they became complete hermits for a couple of years because they were so sad and devastated. We came to know that he was not averse to the idea of, still doing something else with his life, of maybe receiving guests at Malcha Mahal and earning some money through that way. He was also very interested in art. He could have hosted artists there. But I think it became difficult to help them because they had been kind of out of society for so long. It was difficult to deal with them, from what we understand.
And the children wanted to go back to Pakistan, especially Asad. That's why I think that Asad probably was not on the same page with them, especially that's why he stayed behind. Although he played the role of negotiator, but Vilayat had such a personality, she kind of herded them all together.
They talked about missing Pakistan, and she wouldn't really allow them to speak about that.
But then Pakistan was also not a choice for her because we do think that after that, there is not her car being impounded was an act of retaliation by the government. And, and then no stories about her for 10 years and she has to leave. So she was also a woman who was kind of stranded.
Reading the book, I got the sense that in the end, no matter what the truth of the bloodline is and all of that, in the end, this was a family that was sort of trapped in its own delusion. I don't know how much of what Vilayat was saying was sort of consciously engineered, how much she truly believed in. But her children seem definitely to have been trapped in their mother's delusion. And even after the mother dies, they cannot leave that delusion because there's nothing outside it for them.
Yeah, so again, her delusion had a kernel of truth. But which she may have embellished a bit for, again, whether to suit the times or whether that's how her unconscious reacted to the traumas that she had gone through, we cannot say. That's where the empathy comes from.
And the children as well searching for an identity, I guess. But I think also when we talk about I think in the end, it's how we approach them and how we talk about them. And when people are so-called delusional or mad or crazy, it's even though they lived, in some self-chosen isolation, but how they became and how they are, it's not in isolation from society. And they do hold up a mirror to us as well.
No, because that's where the sociological analysis that we've tried to present also comes in. Because, the whole nation building project, again, had several loopholes as well. And somehow, through her unfortunate fate, Vilayat is enmeshed in all these cracks and becomes, end up symbolizing these contradictions that were not matching, National Conference, Muslim Conference, India, Pakistan, partition, what happened with Awadh. So it just becomes, she identified with all of that. So she suffered because of that as well.
I guess when you started the project, from reading the coverage or whatever coverage you've done, you have a certain image of these people in your head. At the end of it, now that this book is done, do they feel like different people than the ones you had begun with?
Yeah, I mean, much more layered, which we had expected. Of course, that's the reason we started this book, because that's what you would expect, that people are more layered than what they seem. But when I think about Vilay, I can imagine her as a girl, as a woman in Karachi in that time, and Sakina as well as a girl in Ganderbal with boys liking her and, thinking of becoming a doctor. Vilayat is swimming there, in the river with her sari on. At some point of time, they were also trying to be, normal, whatever that means.
They were all too human, I would say. I mean, initially there was even for us some element of which mentioned in the book as well, why we are looking into it. Are we also guilty of the same gaze, the Orientalist gaze? But yeah, initially, of course, Vilayat out of all towers above everybody, and her subjectivity is, gives her another kind of aura. But she also became much more humanized, even in her choices and, even in her, we can call it delusion. Yeah, sure. Like, or her chosen embellishment. We don't know, because that remains that there is only a little bit of gap. You can say, maybe somebody can say more or less, but she has a royal connection, but the royalty that she chooses to associate with is not the person most likely that is her ancestor. So I don't know if that was a survival tactic, or she thought that maybe presenting herself as Hazrat Mahal's descendant will get her more press coverage even, or was it a ploy to kind of keep the family going in this absolutely hopeless circumstance? And then she did manage to get pension because of that. She would not have gotten a pension if she had just said, I'm from Mutaf, wives, most likely. So, all these choices that she makes, I would say she became, again, more and more normal and regular, that, you are in a situation, you make your choices, and others as well. They became demystified. Yeah. And that's why it affects us more, in fact, that right around the time we started finishing the book, this whole ghost thing started to happen. And it has happened irrevocably. Yesterday, I saw a social media reel in which somebody is listed 5 haunted properties, and first is Malcha Mahal. It has acquired that place in the urban legend. There's nothing we can do, but we can probably just speak up it.
And I don't know what they would have thought of the book. I'm sure they would have had problems with it, because...
Yeah, I think they would have problems. And
they would have 100% had problems with it, because they couldn't agree on their family history entirely.
Yeah.
But I'm glad you spent the time and that took the care that you did in trying to tell their story. And at the end, if there are strands that you're unable to connect, I think that perhaps that's how it should be, that everything in history cannot and should not be tied up, because people are too complicated for that. We exist in the cracks.
For true, yeah, for sure. We also have peace with that. Thank you.
We reached our peace with that, actually. I must say that both of us are essentially reporters, and we were quite, as you said, the questions we do want to kind of find out and not leave anything but it taught us to leave some things.
Aletta, André and Abhimanyu Kumar are the co-authors of The House of Awadh, A Hidden Tragedy. Find us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram at Express Podcasts. This show was produced by Shashank Bhargava and edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. Thanks for listening. This is Sandip Roy on Express Audio.